This is Drawing is Thinking, Lesson 4, Part 1. Of course, this lesson is going to build directly on what we learned in the last lesson, talking about abstraction and looking at things not as what they really are, but simply as what they appear to be, as shapes, lines, colors, textures. Today we're going to be talking about a strategy that many artists use in order to draw accurately. And what I want to make sure that we do is we don't just do this because we know that it works, because that's where many people stop when they use this very common strategy. But we're also going to talk about why it works, so that we will then in future lessons be able to essentially graduate from needing this tool in order to draw accurately. We can take the concepts from it of why it works and basically be able to draw just directly from observation without needing to use this tool if we don't want to, if we don't want to take the time to do it. So if you haven't guessed yet, what I'm talking about is using a grid. And this is something that we are very familiar with. In fact, you can see it in like coloring books for young children. So it's a concept that's pretty straightforward and extremely helpful for many artists. This concept can also be seen in other kinds of activities. There's those sliding puzzles where you can move the squares around in order to get it to, look like the correct image. And maybe a bit of a leveling up from the coloring book version, we have the art class approach to using a grid in order to draw an accurate image. But as you're probably familiar with, this is not something that has to all be done by the same person. In fact, many art classes do the fun activity where they take an image, often a famous painting, Starry Night is a favorite, and they divide it into squares usually, and give each square to a different person. And each person reproduces what is on their square, and then they are reassembled to create the image. And yes, they do end up looking maybe a little bit disjointed because the squares weren't completed together at the same time. That's kind of part of their charm. But these are just a few examples of how we can use a grid in order to get a coherent and pretty accurate image when we're drawing it, even with, or even especially if, we don't know what the full image looks like. So we know that using a grid works in order to draw an image more accurately. But why does it work? In order to understand this more fully, I want to take a look at the work of a couple of artists who are also playing with this concept. You may be familiar with the work of artist Chuck Close, and if not, you should look him up. It's very interesting. He's most famous for his very large portraits, which he breaks up into a grid, and each square is painted with spots of color. And so when you look close up, you see these different spots of colors in these squares, but when you get some distance from it, you can see more clearly the face. He doesn't only work in this style, however. He also does fully realistic portraits. However, the approach isn't all that different, actually, because in both cases, he is working based on a grid. I thought this image of the artist working was very interesting. You can see how he's using a reference image and blocked off part of it with some tape in order to just look at a section, focus in on a small part of the painting at once, and how he has broken the lower part of the painting into squares and painted them different bright colors, but hasn't gotten it to look like his reference image yet. It's still getting there. And I love this little excerpt with a quote by the artist that talks about how he works and how he's thinking about his work, because it's exactly what we're trying to learn in this lesson today. So let me read it for you. Close works from Polaroid photographs on which he overlays a grid to divide the image into small sections that he methodically scales up and painstakingly paints inch by inch onto a large canvas. To describe the process, he draws a parallel with knitting as he builds up the work row by row. The result is a photorealistic image of a face, but it also becomes its own account of how it was made, with every square inch of the painting as significant as every other. He states that likeness is an automatic byproduct of what I do. The fact that it ultimately stacks up to build an image which has any relation to reality is mystifying to me. So in order to fully understand what he's saying here, we need to pull what we have learned last week and apply it to this quote. This approach would work in order to get an accurate image of something, regardless of whether the artist understands or knows what it is that they are drawing or painting. The grid is a way to help an artist basically reduce the image that they're looking at into shapes and lines. There are two things going on here. So the grid as a whole becomes essentially a map of the canvas, letting the artist see where each piece of the image is relative to other things and be able to measure those accurately instead of by how big you think things ought to be and how far away you think things ought to be from each other. So that's what the grid does for the image as a whole. But at the same time, the grid is breaking up the image into much smaller pieces. When you focus on just a very small piece of an image, it is much, much easier to think in terms of shapes and lines instead of whatever the image is depicting as a whole. In order to understand this more fully, let's look at another artist. Georgia O'Keeffe painted many desert landscapes, bones, etc., but she might be most well known for her flower portraits. Many of these flower paintings are fairly large paintings, but she is also cropping in very close to these flowers, which obviously normally are quite small. Some, like this Morning Glory, still have a little bit of space around the flower, so you get a little bit of context with a glimpse of the leaves, etc. But some are cropped even closer. And an interesting thing happens when you crop things down and get very close to them, is that despite the fact that this is reality, she is painting a realistic painting of a flower. When she crops in this close, it starts to appear abstract. When you get this close, your brain stops reading it as a flower and you start to see it as an arrangement of shapes, colors, lines, and textures. And again, I want to read you a quote from the artist, which it feels so funny to me to say that she gets it, because obviously she gets it, it's her art, but this is exactly the concept that I hope that we can learn from these paintings that she does. Georgia says, "A flower is relatively small. Everyone has many associations with a flower, the idea of flowers. You put out your hand to touch the flower, lean forward to smell it, maybe touch it with your lips without even thinking, or give it to someone to please them. Still, in a way, nobody sees a flower, really. It's so small. And we haven't time, and to really see it takes time. Like to have a friend, that takes time. So I said to myself, I'll paint what I see, what the flower is to me, but I'll paint it big, and they will be surprised into taking time to look at it. And I'll make even busy New Yorkers take time to see what I see, a flower." I love how she talks about how people have these associations of a flower, their idea of what a flower is and how they interact with it, what they do with a flower. But it's different when you stop and take time to really look. And again, that's very closely related to the idea of when we see a flower in the context of how we expect to see a flower with the leaves and the garden all around it, we read it differently than if we get really close to see the details of what it looks like. And when we take the context out, it appears abstract. This is why and how using a grid helps us to draw more accurately. And this is why we're stopping to take time to not just use a grid and move on, but talk about why it works so that we can choose to use other methods to get at the same result if we want to. Using a grid isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I don't want to say or imply that. Many artists use it with great success Chuck Close is just one example. However, it can become a crutch to artists who don't want to have to work that way. So yes, as I'm sure you've guessed, I am going to ask you to use a grid to make a drawing for one of our exercises in this lesson. And I'm going to ask you to not just go through the motions. I want you to pay attention to how the grid makes you think and approach your drawing. So by not just using the grid, but by paying attention to how using the grid makes you work and makes you think about your drawing, we will more fully understand how drawing accurately works and how we could get at the same results, but not necessarily have to print out a photo and break it down into squares in order to draw accurately. So what is the grid doing for us? So first of all, it's a basis of measurement. It helps us to get accurate proportions and distances within our image. So that's what it does on like the full image macro level, but also on a micro level, it helps to break the image down into small pieces that are easier to think of in abstract terms as shapes, lines, colors, and textures, instead of our expectations and idea of how we think things ought to look. So I will provide a PDF to print out and use for this exercise. It will have 2 pages and they need to be in proportion to each other, so just don't mess with the settings. One page has an empty grid, that's the one that you're going to be drawing on. The other page has 2 pieces, so you're going to be cutting it in half along the dotted line. So one is your reference image and the other is basically a window that you're going to be looking through. Obviously, the window isn't essential, but it's just going to make it even easier for us to crop out the context and look at one square at a time. You can draw the squares in any order that you want. Just choose a square, place the window over it so that it blocks out the surrounding squares, and find the corresponding square in your empty grid and reproduce those shapes and lines as accurately as you can. I find that one of the most helpful things when using a grid is to just take note of the edges of your square and where a shape or a line hits it, and just make a judgment of, okay, this line is about 1/3 of the way across this edge of the square, and this shape fills about half of the edge of this side of the square, etc. And you do that square by square, and you will end up with a fairly accurate drawing. You'll see that mine here, it's a little bit disjointed. You can see that these pieces were drawn separately, and so there isn't a whole lot of flow from square to square. This is one of the disadvantages of using a grid, and of course we could go in afterward and smooth things out, but also we're going to be learning in future lessons different approaches that are based on the concepts that a grid is helping us to learn, that will end up with a more unified drawing. But before we get there, we're going to do this grid drawing. It's going to prepare us for what we're going to learn in future lessons. So I know that you have probably done this before. I know, as I said, this is something that you find in coloring books for kids. But we aren't just going through the motions. We are thinking about it and understanding why it works in order to essentially graduate from needing it anymore. So enjoy your grid drawing, and after this we're going to do one more exercise that helps us to work from life and not just printed images. So once you finish your grid drawing, come back for that.